Hello, everybody, and welcome. My name is Alix Piccirilli, and with me is Betsy Pruzinsky, and we're going to be talking about managing the emotions of having a child diagnosed with PKD. We have the Slido QR code. If you have any questions during the session, please feel free to type them in, and then, of course, we'll have some time at the end of the sessions to take them in the room as well. Some disclaimers, some disclosures, and there's us. So again, my name is Alix Piccirilli. I am a military spouse. I am a mom of 2 boys and a miniature dachshund. We live in the Northern Virginia area, and my older son was diagnosed with AR-PKD about 6 years ago when he was 5 years old. He is now 11, and he is doing great. And I am so excited to be here today because I think that we have a similar story to many parents who are diagnosed with, who have a child diagnosed with PKD. When my son was 5, he was wetting the bed quite a bit. And we went to the doctor, and I just said, hey, you know, we've tried a bunch of things. We're cutting back on water at night. Do you have any advice for me? That was really the question. And he was like, you know, you're trying all these things. Why don't we just run some tests and make sure that everything's okay? And a month later, we end up in a nephrologist's office, and the doctor looked at me and said, I don't like the way that his kidneys look at all. They're huge, they're covered in cysts, and I think your son has something called AR-PKD. And I'm condensing the timeline a little bit in the discussion that we had, but I immediately felt like I started to shake, and I was like, well, what does this mean? I'd never heard of this. We had no family history of it. And I asked her, well, what's the prognosis? Isn't there something he can just take? And she said, no, this disease doesn't have any treatment and it doesn't have a cure. And I said, well, what's the prognosis? And she said, well, we're sending more kids into adulthood than we were. And that was it. And that's how I left the doctor's office. And I immediately fell apart with one sentence. And I'm pretty tough. I'm a military spouse. I've been through deployments. My husband was gone for a year when my kids are 2 and 4. I'm tough. And this leveled me, absolutely leveled me. It was about 9 months later. I had a friend that recommended we find some researchers and find out what's really going on with the disease because, of course, Dr. Google was incredibly scary as well. Everything that I was finding was just the worst case scenario. 9 months later, we found Dr. Gay Woodford, and I went into her office, and she was incredible. She is an amazing researcher on AR-PKD and pretty much sat us down and walked us through, look, I know you've read Google and the list of doom of all of the things that might happen to your child, but you're nowhere near that. He's doing really well, and you can take comfort in that. And that was when I realized how important it was to have a researcher on your side. And I looked at her and I said, how do I help you? I said, I know nothing about, I don't have a medical background. I said, I do communications and marketing and training, and how do I help you? And she said, I'm gonna connect you with the PKD Foundation. That's what you need to do. You need to go talk to them. And she also connected me with another mom named Michelle who has 2 children with AR-PKD. And Michelle also helped me through this initial diagnosis, understanding where we were and what we could do next. So when the foundation reached out to me to do this presentation today, they said, we'd like to have you talk about your experience, but also have a medical professional with a mental health professional with you to do this presentation. They said, we're still looking for somebody. I said, no, don't. I said, don't wait. You don't need to find anybody else. I have the perfect person. And so I immediately called Betsy, and I'm going to let her introduce herself and tell you why she's perfect for this as well.
As she said, my name is Betsy. I have 2 kids diagnosed with AR-PKD. I am a licensed professional counselor. I started my private practice a little over 10 years ago with the intent, after my experience of experiencing postpartum depression after having my first, who is not affected. And then I kind of gradually grew my practice to focus more on helping parents deal with or manage, and recognize those emotions of kids that do have complex medical diagnoses. And we know that any stressors of things like that can also add to that postpartum period as well. So I love what I do. My kids are, a little different experience with finding out the diagnoses. As I had mentioned, our oldest is not affected. Caroline is our middle, and she was diagnosed shortly after birth. So after she was born, they really didn't like the size of her kidneys, took her for an ultrasound. The doctor basically came in, handed us, the neonatologist, very nice guy, had no clue what this was, handed us a packet of information and said, we think this is what it is. And, when, again, like Dr. Google, I wasn't Googling yet, I had this paper from a doctor and it said, morbidity rate and all of this, and it's like, what? Like, you're going to send us home with this little baby that you don't think is going to live for more than 30 days? Because we didn't know any better. And finally found a nephrologist shortly after. I think she probably was 11 days old or something. And he was incredible. Kind of same story. When you find that right doctor, it's don't worry about this yet. Like, she's doing fine. We'll monitor her blood pressure, medications, things like that. But really encouraged finding a support system. It took a long time, though, because, again, like Alix expressed, it hits hard when you get this diagnosis of, there's very few people, very few parents, no real community for that. And or information, really. So it took a few years, and I know Alix is going to talk a little about, in just a minute, about, those emotions and those feelings that you go through. But for us, then, it took about 4 years before we decided that we still wanted to expand our family, even knowing the risks. So you can kind of get stuck in that process with those emotions for a long time. So I'm very appreciative to be here, and yes.
It's wonderful. I'm so glad you said yes and had the weekend free. And your mom could watch your kids too.
Yes.
So one of the things that I think struck me the most, and I think this is so common for AR families, is that we are given just the worst case scenario of what could happen. And when I was frantically looking for information that first week, right, there's no doctors that can really guide us or tell you really have to find a researcher or somebody who's done this before. They may have never seen an ARPKD patient before, which is, we were living in kind of a remote area, and that was definitely true in our case. But so many of our families are just given this terrible, no hope option, and this is why I really wanted to do this session, because there is hope, and there is a way, a path through this. And I'm not sitting up here saying I know how the correct way and the only way. This is just to say to you that there is a way through this, and getting to the other side of this is absolutely possible. And I think Betsy would agree, we have great kids, we're happy and healthy and funny and silly and get in trouble and all of those things. But getting there can be a real challenge. And I cried every day for 3 months, and that's not an exaggeration. And I would hide it from my kids. I'd go cry in the shower, was how I dealt with it for 3 months. At the end of 3 months, I said to myself, oh my gosh, I can't do this. I can't live like this. And so I gave myself, I said, every other day you're allowed to cry until we figured it out. And I was with my sister-in-law, who is an elementary school counselor and one of my very good friends. And she said, hey, how are you doing? And I said, I was like, I'm all right. I said, I'm so stressed. And she took one look at me and she said, you realize this isn't stress, right? This is grief. And at that moment, it just opened my eyes to what I was experiencing, and it made so much more sense, right? I couldn't run enough, which is usually my main stress reliever. I couldn't talk to friends enough. I just couldn't get ahead of how I was feeling. I was feeling guilt. Get this, I know so many people say to me that they feel guilty that they've given this to their child. I felt guilty that my child wasn't worse. I was reading all this stuff and I was like, oh my gosh, we're so lucky. Why can't I snap out of this? Why do I feel so guilty that there's these babies who are so much worse? And then I was like, what a terrible mom am I that I feel this way? And it made sense because I'm grieving. which is just a different thing than grief. I realized that I had emotional distress and needed some help when I got to the anger phase. I was so angry, and this was not something that this is not an emotion that I knew how to deal with. Again, I'll run, I'll work out, I'll hang out with friends. I was so angry that this was happening to us. I had plans, and I eat healthy, and all of it. Oh my goodness. Whew. Okay. And I just couldn't believe that this was happening. And so it wasn't until I reached out and I got a counselor that I was able to work through and process these emotions that I was having. And so I'm going to pass it over to Betsy, because I know, and I'm also interested to hear about how it was different from Caroline to Aaron. So.
So I think that had I had somebody explain those emotions when you first experienced that early on, I would have had a much different experience with dealing with that diagnosis in the very beginning. 4 years later, when we had our youngest, we knew what we were dealing with at that time. We had our specialists, we had our team of doctors who were very reassuring and helpful in just saying, like your kid's going to be okay. Yes, there's going to be struggles, and we have had our fair share. We went through our daughter being listed for dual transplant with dealing with cholangitis for probably about 6 to 8 months before they really kind of figured out what it was, listed her for dual transplant. And then we kind of did some, uncommon med changes, and she really stabilized after that and got taken off the list. And that was 8 years ago. So in that very early on period when you just think that there is no hope, that there really is. And our kids, as much as they struggle with things, it's still just part of them. They still enjoy life. My daughter plays volleyball and basketball and runs track, and it's awesome. You would never think of that would have happened. I would have never dreamed that, or dreamt that, sorry. When she was little, it was very much doom and gloom. Not anymore at all. With our son, we had kind of shifted that perspective. I was about 18 weeks pregnant, knew we had the history of it, so they were looking for it. So I went in for my, with the MFM, and she was kind of looking at it and, looking at the ultrasound, left the room, and then came back, and I could tell that she had just probably Googled something really quick and basically just described exactly what this prognosis was. And I was like, yeah, I know. She's like, what? And I was like, yeah, our daughter has it, and she's fine. And she was like, you know what, your kid's not going to have a quality of life, and really strongly suggested termination at that time too. And I already knew what we were dealing with, and I knew that my daughter had a great life, even though she had some struggles. After dealing with all these emotions, we got to a place of acceptance. Not saying that you still don't shift through those emotions all the time, but really getting to a place of acceptance that this is our normal. It doesn't look like everybody else's normal. That's okay. I have friends that walk in and our counter might be full of syringes, right, because of all the medication they take. It doesn't even faze me anymore, right? So I think that it was a very different experience having that education and that knowledge and power to tell it, to be able to say, no, I know what this looks like. Emotionally, we have our support system, we have our doctors. And even if, your baby doesn't see it, they don't see anything prenatally or even right after, it doesn't guarantee a perfect, healthy life anyway. So I just felt much more empowered just with that education and support system and understanding and knowing what my emotions would look like afterwards. So.
And I think it would be fair to say, too, and I'll see if you agree, that when you get to acceptance, that doesn't mean you have to like it, right? And it doesn't mean that if I could, I'd snap my fingers and, make it all go away tomorrow. But I think that's part of being part of the PKD Foundation and working towards those things to fix it, or accept that this is here, but we still have a fantastic life with our kids.
Absolutely. And to touch on that just a little bit, I mentioned, just that this is part of their identity. And, especially with a 13-year-old daughter who has body image issues, she's a tiny girl, but her stomach's very distended, her spleen's enlarged, liver, kidneys, all of that, just helping them manage this too. This is just part of who she is. And, she still is, there's all those other aspects that you really have to focus on too, so. Okay, so once you figure out that you are stressed and grieving or not just having a stress response, I think it's really important to be able to figure out how you can manage that. I know you had mentioned that you started seeing a therapist. I wish somebody would have told me to do that. However, when we got my daughter's diagnoses, I was actually in the middle of getting my master's at that time. And so I think that what I did, and it talks about identifying your response to stress. So as soon as we found that, found out the diagnoses, I probably could have talked to my professors and taken, a few classes off or something. Absolutely did not do that. I dove into everything to be just completely distracted, and that was my coping mechanism at the time. I joined anything I could, researched everything I could, but I never dealt with those emotions of it. And that's when I finished my master's, started my practice, and just kind of dove right into it. And so I think helping recognize what your response is, then you're able to figure out what you can do about it. If I knew I was being distracted from dealing with that, I can say, okay, let's take some time to actually talk about what's going on. Talking to other families too, and recognizing that this is a common thing for people to go through. I think everybody goes through it. So, but find out what your response is. Are you irritable, depressed, anxious, different things, and then you can kind of work to tackle those. I mentioned pay attention to your surroundings, because so often when you get caught up in looking up things or researching or all of that, your brain, especially with anxiety, can go to all the what ifs, and you want to know what it's going to look like. You want problems to solve. You want to just keep going there. But we forget to be present in the moment then too. And so one of the best things in that moment, and one of the things that I work with a lot of people on, is simply the easiest statement is to say, we're okay right now. I don't know what this future looks like, but if you can remind yourself right now that you are okay, then it can help bring you back to that moment. And I realized later on the bottom that I did not put grounding techniques down, but that's one of the best things. Just sitting, recognizing your surroundings, and kind of repeating one of those phrases. Just a very simple thing to do that. The other thing I'd like to point out too, because then it talks about finding things you enjoy and things like that, but if you don't have your basic needs met first, if you are feeling stressed, anxious, depressed, maybe recognize maybe you're not sleeping well. So it's really difficult to try and incorporate other things if your basic needs aren't first being met. So keeping an eye on that, kind of resolving that, and then you can kind of go back into, what does our life look like? This is still, again, just part of our life. What does it look like outside of that? I know one of the things I love to do, is horseback ride. So I got back into that after I was like, okay, I know what this looks like. I know what I can do. And then I found something that I enjoyed that also was not just me as a parent of kids who were diagnosed with a disease, but also I'm still me too. And you have to fill that up and have those other identity parts of you, recognized as well. So, and then absolutely finding somebody to talk to. I think it's so incredibly powerful to have a community of people to share experiences, other parents for sure. A lot of times in your small group of friends, I know in my circle, nobody else deals with stuff like this. And I read this incredible book that really helped put a lot of my feelings, or recognized why I felt maybe so isolated and alone, because people would say all the time, well, at least she's home. At least, you're fine, or you're not in the hospital right now. And it's what you hear, though, is, so don't be sad, instead of acknowledging exactly what is going on. So that's, if anybody wants the name of that book, I would be happy to share. But it's called It's Okay, You're Not Okay. It's a really great book about grief. So having that community, finding, a therapist, especially someone who is knowledgeable in working with chronic disease, because you go through these processes of not only your own grief, but then your kid is going to experience that as well. And as they start to get older, we see it in our 9-year-old, we see it in our 13-year-old, and figuring out how you can help them manage all the emotions of this as well.
Yeah, and I think that's just so key, right? Mm-hmm. I think I took away 3 things that when I talk about our story and just kind of moving through to try and get to the resilience piece, that I realized after I had talked with a counselor was the first thing I tell people is that the people that love you, your friends, your parents, they don't know what to say to you. No one does unless they're doing this. And that's why you get very often the platitudes of like, they just want you to feel better, right? They're doing it out of love, but it falls woefully short of what you need. And so that being able to talk to somebody who's a professional, they're a, it's their job for a reason. They have specific training. They're able to walk you through what you're thinking and those emotions. I think the second thing that was really powerful from going to speak with somebody was I realized that I could say things to my counselor that I couldn't say to the people that I loved. The deep, dark things that I was afraid of and most afraid of, I couldn't say to my husband. I didn't want him to think those two. One of us needed to keep it together because it clearly wasn't going to be me. So having somebody that I could say those things to and not say it to my mom, who also maybe even loves my son more than she loves me as a grandparent, I didn't want her to be afraid also, and I wanted to protect people. So having a counselor to be able to say those things to in a safe space was really, really critical. And I think the third, and I mean, if you're still on the fence, if this is something you recognize from the story that I'm telling, was after my first session, I felt lighter. Mm-hmm. And after my second session, I started to feel better. Like, that was within a 2-week span, and I had been dealing with it for months. So I'm just a huge proponent. And that really helped me get to the place where I could start managing stress. Because even though this is happening in your life, all of the other things that you manage and are still going on that are stressful in your job and your other children and your spouse and just trying to make life happen are still all going on. And so I was much better at being able to identify when I was hitting my tipping point, when I knew that I needed to kind of take a step back. And I think actually the number one thing for me was making sure I got enough sleep. Everything was better when I was getting enough sleep. I was making better choices about being able to exercise, or, I wasn't just grabbing snacks so that I could fuel to get through the day. Sleep was a number one thing.
And that's one of those basic needs that have to be met. Getting enough sleep isn't going to solve your problems, but it helps you manage them better. Yeah, absolutely.
And I think too, as moms in the world of social media, I think sometimes there's an image portrayed out there of how you should be managing your stress. And I made the joke before where it's all these people I do yoga and I meditate, and that's fantastic for people that do that. But I've always had a lot of energy, and again, as I mentioned, I was very angry. I was if there was a rage yoga class, I might be able to take that, but that was just not the outlet that worked for me. And so it wasn't this picture of, what people portray. It's really finding the thing that you connect with that makes you feel better, like horseback riding,
And there is a list of common, just basic relaxation technique, things like that, to help promote that stress reduction. And but not everything works for everybody. So don't be discouraged if you're trying something. You have to find what works for you. Deep breathing does not work for me because it doesn't turn my brain off. I need to focus on something else besides just, so it really is finding what works for you in those stressful moments too.
And so this is our last slide, just talking about building resilience. I think that we've touched on a lot of these points throughout the session. I think one of the things that I recommend for people is making a plan. And building your team is one of the things that really helped me feel grounded. And the plan can, maybe the start of your plan is only 1 or 2 steps, and that's fine. And maybe that first step is finding a researcher or building the team. Maybe that's the first step. But we have interview different doctors. The first doctor that we went to who told me that they're sending more kids into adulthood, we did not go back. We went and we found other doctors that were able to communicate in a way that was sensitive to what we were going through and what we were dealing. One of my favorite GIs who we saw in the very beginning, and I went and I told him where we were at, and I was like, how can you help us? And he said, I don't know a lot about this disease, but what I'm going to do is this. I'm going to leave this room and I'm going to go make a couple of phone calls to people that are smarter than me. And I'm going to come back into this room and you and I are going to have a plan and you're going to get your life back. That was it. And I was like, you're on board. Welcome to Team Piccirilli. So, and I'm thankful for doctors like that every day. One of the other things too is I know I keep mentioning researchers. Through the foundation, I've been able to meet Dr. Dell and Dr. Hartung, and they specialize in AR, but they're very knowledgeable on all PKD. We don't live close enough where they could be my son's regular doctor. We have a fantastic local team, a fantastic local nephrologist who monitors my son. And then what we do is we get a referral every couple of years to go out and double check with a researcher. We participate in studies, and these things have been so empowering that I have the best eyes in the world looking at him and watching him. And even though we don't see them all the time, I have them in my corner, and it's been really a fantastic thing. So I don't know if what would you recommend on this slide that's been like meaningful to you?
Absolutely having that connection and that support, because when you do get those diagnoses and feelings of hopelessness, or just that there's not enough information out there to even have that help and support for your family and your child, when you do meet that doctor who is like, nope, I know that eventually you're going to know more about this than I do, but let me go help and find, the right people to go to. So we have the same thing. We have a great group of doctors locally for us, but we travel to other different places and make sure that we're connected to those other specialists. And they're the ones who, are reassuring of like, oh yeah, we just saw this kid and they're, like 18 now or 19, or they're transitioning into adult care. So I think having that support system, again, just reinforces that light at the end of the tunnel, right? That we can get through this. And so,
yeah, I think volunteering for the PKD Foundation has also been just a way that I, again, accept it, but just like refuse to like it, right? And so I found other people who feel the same way. And I think that's been fantastic, because I've met so many fantastic people who just want to help, right? Raise money and find a cure and connect with other parents that are dealing with the same thing. So I've said yes to many different activities within the foundation, and that has been just it's a place where I can channel my energy and I can channel my frustrations with things into a really positive way. And I feel like I'm doing something. I feel like I'm poking it in the eye. So, and that has been fantastic. I think that for folks who are in like maybe the beginning stages, this may not be for you. If you have children under 5 and you're still in the hiney wiping phase, just hang on, right? You have a lot on your plate already, but getting involved has been really fantastic. Also being aware of studies that have gone on. My son has participated in quite a few, and we make a weekend trip out of it. We see new cities. We went to Philly to go to CHOP over in the fall, and I have pictures of them with the Rocky statue and running up it's not all doom and gloom, right? It's part of our life, but it doesn't define us. So that is the end of our session, and I just wanted to know if there was any questions. And I know I had two that somebody else gave me that we can ask, and I'll ask you them. I will ask you. Our first question is, how do you manage talking about it with your child that is not impacted by PKD?
Yes, and I think if we had another hour to talk about unaffected kids, we could definitely fill that. Our experience, when we brought our daughter home, we had a 17-month-old as well. So obviously he did not understand or really, he had no clue what was going on. As she got older and, when she was about 5, that's when she started to get really sick and declined pretty fast. He was 6. Still doesn't really understand the concept. She would go to the hospital and come home with balloons and stuffed animals, and every single doctor's appointment have a toy given to her. And kids don't really understand, like they just want attention, whether they think it's positive or negative. They're getting that reinforcement. And so I thankfully had friends who, even though our daughter was probably in the hospital or she would just come home, they would always bring our son something too, and just recognizing that he still needed to be acknowledged. As they've gotten older, I've gotten a lot better at making sure that he is just as included in everything that we can. He always came to the doctor's appointments with us. pre-COVID. Our specialist appointments, we would make trips out of it too. We go to Milwaukee for our specialty care, and we would go to the zoo. We would do, but he was always included in those. And I think having those open conversations, and again, he's 15 now, so by having those open conversations with him, he's been able to say, I'm worried about them, like I'm scared, like I don't know what's gonna happen, and it's so important to share those emotions and to know that it's okay that you're going through this. It can feel very, unsettling when you're feeling anger and denial, and until you can recognize that this is a grieving process, to be able to put that and say, no, this is why I'm experiencing this. He also has the same, process as well, because we don't let him, wrestle with his brother, or, it's just a different awareness for him as well. So but having those conversations, not just with your affected children as they start to get older, but also the ones who are not, and how they can manage and express themselves as well.
Yeah, we did a very similar thing, because my younger son is not affected, and he was just like, well, why does he get medication and I don't, right? And I was like, well, you don't want this. But why does he get, all this attention? Why are we always going to doctors? So bringing them to doctor's appointments, and then also just including them. So we have this thing in our family, everybody brings a water bottle when we leave the house. And so they get to go on Amazon and they get to pick out the color that they want, and just including little things like that, just to make sure that it's not just one person's responsibility, my older son's responsibility to stay healthy and take care of him. It's everybody. And just, making, it's a team effort, right?
We would, for our 6-year-old, fill up little syringes of water, so he would take his water when the other ones got their medicine. So however you can make it feel like as normal as possible. So
yeah. I think, and the second question is, in the beginning, or when Caroline and both Aaron were old enough to start understanding why they needed to go, what was happening and going to the doctor so much, what did you tell them? How did you explain it to them?
So that's interesting, because with everything, why do we do things to take care of ourselves? And it looks different for everybody, whether you're, wanting to make sure that you're eating healthy or, drinking enough water. They need medication to help their blood pressure stabilize, right? And so they want to, I really encourage them to focus on taking care of their body, and that we need to check in with our doctors, and we need, so I would even bring them to some of my appointments too, to show that it's not just them, and they're not alone too. But again, also focusing on because they're both in school too, so they see other kids, they see, and other kids are like, why do you take that? Why do you look like that? Or, so helping them, encouraging them to be able to explain to somebody also why they have to go to the doctor, explaining, so that they're empowered with the knowledge about what they experience as well.
Yeah, I think that, my son was in kindergarten, when he was diagnosed, and he really hates to give blood, I think, or, I think all of them do, because it's uncomfortable. Nobody likes it. And he would ask me, like, why he has to do this. And I said to him, your kidneys are special, and they're inside your body. And so the doctors can't look at them to see what's going on. And the way that the doctors can see them is if they take your blood. And that's why we need to do it. And I know that nobody likes it. Everybody has to do this, but it's your responsibility to take care of your body and keep it as healthy as possible.
Has no clue, right? Yeah.
Great question.
Yeah.
Do you want to start?
Sure. My kids go to a smaller private school, so we have not had to implement any type of IEPs or 504 plans or anything like that. Looking now into high school, I think that's going to be more important, but we sit down and we meet with every teacher prior to the school year starting. The office has a letter, and I really focus also on making sure that they have the knowledge of if something were to happen, if it was an emergency. Don't call me first, right? Like, you want to make sure they're calling the proper place. So I also, yes, going to friends' houses can be difficult too, I think just in general, but you just having that conversation and letting people know this is something that they need, and either whether it's critical or it's not. If my daughter went over to a friend's house and they didn't feel comfortable giving her medication, because that's something I always ask as well. If she doesn't get her blood pressure medicine right at like 1 o'clock, it's fine if she gets it at 3 o'clock when she comes home. As they get older, like she takes her own pills now. She's very much in control of that and manages that very well and is aware. So you want to empower your kids again, as they get older. But when they were like 3 or 4, I don't know, that would be, I probably didn't leave. I probably just stayed there. So
I think, yeah, and I think that for us, my husband and I often, there's a saying, I don't know where it comes from, but it's preparing the child for the path, not the path for the child. And so I think this is very age appropriate, like it depends on the age, but we really want our son to feel empowered to make those choices and be responsible for remembering to take his medicine and drinking water. We're not looking for perfection, we're looking for consistency. And I think so going to a friend's house, I always, talk to the parent for like making sure somebody's there and stuff. But like, if they're going to a friend's house and they're having pizza for dinner, has a lot of salt, 2 slices is the max, And it was really funny because sometimes they're going to make the right choice and sometimes they're not. But this is the age where we start doing these things, because as we get older, these issues are just going to keep going. They're just going to be different situations and scenarios. And so it was funny because we sent over both my boys to a friend's house the other night, and they're like, he had 2 slices, and then he asked me if we had any apples. And so I was very proud of him for sticking with what we kind of had discussed and prepped before. I think when they're younger, it's very key to it's building the team and the people you trust. My mom once said to me, it's really important that your kids know that they're safe even if you're not there, and other people love them. And so it was really great having I have wonderful parents and stepdad and in-laws who were really open to what we needed to happen when we left our kids with them. And then when they were a little bit older, we got a babysitter. It's trusting that babysitter, and I said to the babysitter, I was like, I know this sounds really neurotic, but you're going to be the first person outside the family giving him medication tonight. Would you mind texting me while I'm on my date with my husband to confirm that he has received his medicine? She did it, and she's like, no problem. She's like, I've got you, right? And so even like simple things like that, it's having people in your life that understand. I try and be direct with what we need and not blow it out of proportion, but it's like, this is what I need so that I can go relax and have a good time. Can you help me with this?
One quick other thing, though, too, for the school purposes, for other kids to understand, there's a book called Logan's Bumpy Kidneys, and it was written by a mom that my kids, when they were younger, they took it with them, and the teacher would read it in class at the beginning of every school year. More so for my daughter. My younger son does not like attention, so he just probably pretends it's not there. But even just for other people to understand, and it's a very simple, easy book for kids to kind of grasp. So that was a big help in that, feeling comfortable with leaving them at school too.
Any other questions? All right. Thank you guys so much for coming today. We really appreciate it. So thank you.
Thank you.